Helena Petrovna Blavatsky is a name that will mean little to the overwhelming majority of religious people today. For those who have come across her name, it may have been as the subject of a piercing insult, given by the occasional atheistic or dogmatic critic. At the other extreme, you may have heard her touted as something akin to the rugged mistress of modern occult philosophy, joined with a summary of her life, her strange personality, and the controversies that preceded her. What is rarer to learn about Blavatsky are the contents in her great work, the foundational jewel of the Theosophical Society, the Secret Doctrine. At nearly 1,500 pages, not counting the unfinished state of the hundreds of pages comprising her third volume, which was unfinished at the time of her death, it is no surprise that few minds ever suffer the time to examine it, or better yet, put it down to rush into other corners of necessary study and practice in order to comprehend its exhausting volume of Sanskrit phrases, references, ancient philosophical concepts, and its poignant critiques of the then developing 19th century scientific materialism. It is for perfectly good reasons that the Secret Doctrine is simultaneously perplexing, nauseating, and enigmatical. For many of us, it has more utility as a brick for the fireplace than the object of contemplation. Blavatsky was, after all, not beyond contradiction, and admits to deliberate instances of misleading language, convinced as she was that the initiated adepts would be able to transmute the symbolic material in her writings into philosophic gold. To pick up her work and even enunciate the probability that it has inherent value is, to many personalities, a cause for derision and dismissal. But as these things go, dismissal in the case of Blavatsky is the easier method of treatment, especially while we still squirm on a precipice between an age of further spiritual retardation and a greater age of awakening. To convey even a fraction of the mystical principles, comparisons, and theological insights given throughout Blavatsky's work is a monumental labor. To express all of it is something on the order of the Titan Atlas hoisting a bridge between earth and heaven while riding a unicycle on top of a flying dragon. But a bridge is only good insofar as it serves as a crossing point. Left where it is, untrodden and unworn, it rests much like most of the copies of the Secret Doctrine do today, collecting dust and mold spores on a shelf of old obscurities, relegated by the falling sands of time to serve some select or troubled few who reach for it and set off on the epic journey from chapter to chapter. I have naively undertaken this journey more than once, and though I have discovered great treasure islands, I nonetheless come out of the Secret Doctrine crashing my ship on some coral reef of ignorance, whereupon I take a lifeboat to some second-order study to better understand the many unpeeled layers when I return. The entire life of Madame Blavatsky, her youth in Russian Ukraine, her early signs of psychic prowess, and her many true and possibly dubious adventures across the world, is a longer tale we must surrender to a later date. It will serve the purposes of this essay simply to share the following. Helena was born in 1831 to parents of the Russian and German nobility, her maternal ancestors being among the oldest families of the Russian Empire. She was accustomed at an early age to getting what she wanted, and one of her earliest biographies, compiled from family records, tells us that from her earliest years, she was brought up in an atmosphere of legends and popular fancy. As far back as her remembrances go, she was possessed with a firm belief in the existence of an invisible world of supermundane and submundane spirits, and beings inextricably blended with the life of each mortal. In letter 228, written by Blavatsky, she says, "For over 6 years, from the time I was 8 or 9 years old until I grew up to the age of 15, I had an old spirit who came every night to write through me in the presence of my father, aunts, and many other people. She gave a detailed account of her life, stated where she was born, how she married, and gave the history of all her children. Well, this lasted, as I said, nearly 6 years, my writings, in her clear, old-fashioned, peculiar handwriting and grammar, in German, a language I'd never learned to write and could not even speak well, and in Russian, accumulating in these 6 years to a heap of manuscripts that would have filled 10 volumes. In those days, this was not called spiritualism, but possession. The young Helena was often sick, a sleepwalker, and on one occasion seemed to frighten a boy into running away into a forest by threatening to have him tickled to death by a Rusalka spirit. The boy was never seen alive again, and the causes of his death remain a mystery. At around 11 years old, she was demonstrating more psychic abilities that caused her Orthodox nurses of the Greek Church to have her routinely purified with holy water, and priests to attempt exorcisms on her. Her well-known trait of mood swings and excitable behaviors were already manifest at this time, and would apparently cling to her for her entire life, notwithstanding her compassion and kindness. At 15, she was riding men's horses. At 17, she was provoked into a marriage with the much older Nikifor Blavatsky, who she admits to having a fondness for because he believed her stories of the supernatural. Quote, "You may have heard, or maybe you would not listen to the rumor, that my great-grandfather on my mother's side had a strange library containing hundreds of books on alchemy, magic, and other occult sciences. I had devoured these volumes before the age of 15. All the devilries of the Middle Ages had found refuge in my head, and soon neither Paracelsus, Coenrath, nor C. Agrippa would have had anything to teach me. Do you know why I married old Blavatsky? Because whereas all the young men laughed at magical superstitions, he believed in them." This marriage, however, was unconsummated and was an enclosure that could not detain her adventurous and ambitious spirit. After disastrous months of quarrels, she fled the marriage and began what would become a series of travels in search for occult wisdom. By 1855, if we trust her reports, she had already traveled through Greece, Egypt, Turkey, Western Europe, Canada, the US, Central America, India, and made her first entry into Tibet. By then, she had met one of the mysterious Indians who she recognized from her childhood visions, a Mahatma, or master, who helped prepare her for her great work to come. In her later visits to Tibet, she claimed to live with more than one master and trained with the Great White Brotherhood. For it was in Blavatsky that the masters found their vessel and channel for the spiritual work of the time, which would culminate in her first major literary achievement, Isis Unveiled. After failing to find a private society which both admitted women and would support her work without undermining her, she said she was sent to America to gather around herself a brotherhood, regardless of race or creed, and this at a time when the spiritualist movement was conducting many seances in attempts to contact spirits of the dead. Blavatsky, however, challenged the spiritualists, claiming they were not in touch with the genuine disembodied souls of the deceased, but rather their astral shells, if not certain tricksters or the bums of the astral plane, still attached to the mundane affairs of this world. In 1874, she met Henry Steele Olcott, who had much to say about Blavatsky as the outstanding specimen she was, large, obnoxious, and always rolling a cigarette, for she was plainly addicted to tobacco. In New York, in 1875, she co-founded the Theosophical Society, an organization created as a universal brotherhood of man to study the esoteric mystical wisdom of the ages and present to the Western rational mind a total scheme of ancient and timeless theology with as much scientific and historic grounding as was possible at the time. By this time, Blavatsky had studied the great histories and religious texts, fully conversant with the lineage of Masonic philosophy and manuscripts, and generally every other secretive society who claimed to reserve a hidden teaching at its center, whether it be Rosicrucianism, Gnosticism, alchemy, Hermeticism, or esoteric Buddhism, which was a system she was personally inclined to believe. Now, although Blavatsky criticized the spiritualists for producing phenomena and profaning the sacred, she allegedly received her instructions from the masters through the most mysterious means. Letters from the masters would appear to materialize out of thin air and fall down from the ceiling above her writing desk, containing various instructions. She could quote sometimes verbatim from translations of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit texts without necessarily possessing the book before her, seemingly staring into the distance as if reading from an astral record. There are anecdotes of persons being tapped on the shoulder while Blavatsky stared at them from across the room, and of course the famous teacup incident. In 1880, while in northern India, Blavatsky was under pressure to produce phenomena and demonstrate her abilities. After repeated requests, one of the attendants of this picnic asked if Blavatsky could make an object materialize, such as the teacup and a saucer that matched the set of their hosts. It is reported by one witness, A.P. Sinnett, initially a skeptic, that she entered a brief trance and then indicated a spot in the ground at the stump of a tree where the object could be found. Sure enough, a servant dug through this previously undisturbed soil and found, beneath the roots of the tree itself, an exact match of the teacup and saucer wrapped in cloth and undamaged. This event, occurring before witnesses and with little room for pre-planning and trickery, astounded everyone present, and proceeded to inspire many theosophists not to awe and woo with etheric methods of manifestation, but rather to take more seriously the teachings and material Blavatsky would include in her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. After all, finding a teacup in the earth was less influential than, say, helping stir the beginning phase of Gandhi's spirituality, around the time Gandhi briefly met Blavatsky in 1889. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky attempts to illustrate what is an entirely parallel dimension of history when compared with the normative worldview, replete with its own epic sagas, empires, giants, god-men, cataclysms, long historical epochs, and migrations. To take her at her word, those of her masters, and that of the more than 1,200 sources she weaves together to support it, modern civilization is little more than the latest advance of a humanity finally recovered from the last cataclysmic episode, a humanity which has been spinning around with the world for millions of years in different forms. It is nothing but the proud contempt for antiquity and the pseudo-progression of so-called scientific materialism and hyper-rationalism that has allowed the Western mind to present itself as the premier custodian and progenitor of the universal truth. A truth these pretenders believe to have found in the mere illusionary matter of the world. To Blavatsky, however, the loud-mouthed atheists and Darwinists of our time are more lost than the sunken continent of Lemuria. And we find in the preface of The Secret Doctrine the ultimate goal of her work being, quote, to show that nature is not a fortuitous concurrence of atoms, and to assign to man his rightful place in the scheme of the universe, to rescue from degradation the archaic truths which are the basis of all religions, and to uncover to some extent the fundamental unity from which they all spring, finally, to show that the occult side of nature has never been approached by the science of modern civilization. The Secret Doctrine is divided into two major completed volumes. Volume 1 is Cosmogenesis and deals with the spiritual origins of matter, the cosmos, planets, and the world. Volume 2 is Anthropogenesis and relates to the creation and evolution of mankind and its many peculiar versions over time. The Secret Doctrine is apparently based on a more ancient text, conveyed to certain initiates in Central Asia by divine beings, the Book of Dzan, whose stanzas Blavatsky repeatedly excerpts prior to embarking on lengthy comparisons with this text and all those that come later. This book does not exist in any known European library, and it may as well have been exclusively in her and her master's possession, rendering its verification impossible for her critics and supporters. Nonetheless, the main doctrine of the book, is said to be discoverable in many thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts, a volume of works which Blavatsky points out is not entirely unknown to exist, being that there are still numerous caves acting as vast repositories for untranslated texts today, such as those tens of thousands of scrolls in Tibet discovered in the Sakya Monastery Library. A central principle throughout the Secret Doctrine is one of a universal reconciliation of religious sects. The tendency to continually separate and fragment into ever more marginal religious dogmas and minute differences is, after all, conjoined to the tragic tendency of the human soul to be projected further into matter and separateness by way of the ego's illusory proclivity to dominate, when in fact the ego is only a part of the human equipment insomuch as it can support the aims of the higher self and not control every aspect of an individual's reality. Quote, "The true philosopher, the student of the esoteric wisdom, entirely loses sight of personalities, dogmatic beliefs, and special religions. Moreover, esoteric philosophy reconciles all religions, strips every one of its outward human garments, and shows the root of each to be identical with that of every other great religion. It proves the necessity of an absolute divine principle in nature. It denies deity no more than it does the sun." Blavatsky proposes her second assertion of the doctrine to be that of the law of periodicity, or the, quote, "flux and reflux, ebb and flow, which physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature. An alteration such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking, is a fact so common, so perfectly universal and without exception, that it is easy to comprehend that in it we see one of the absolutely fundamental laws of the universe. Moreover, the Secret Doctrine teaches, quote, "the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal Oversoul, the latter being itself an aspect of the unknown root, and the obligatory pilgrimage for every soul, a spark of the former, through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accordance with cyclic and karmic law, during the whole term. In other words, no purely spiritual divine soul can have an independent conscious existence before the spark which issued from the pure essence of the universal sixth principle, or the Oversoul, has passed through every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that Manvantara and acquired individuality, first by natural impulse and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant up to the holiest archangel." In Blavatsky's worldview, it was held that every thought created or evoked leaves an imprint upon the astral fluid, which serves like a mirror or receptacle, and every word uttered is a means of definition and manifestation of thought principles existing already in some template form in the astral plane. In this way, the speech of humans is always, whether consciously or unconsciously, a blessing or a curse, an activity representative of a more powerful spiritual potential. With this understanding in mind, the doors to a great deal of the ancient magical systems are opened. Vibration, or an individual state of being, plus intention, plus ritual, plus belief, equals result. But where the ancients and occultists have deemed this to be magical, and thus incurred the scorn of the physicalist factions of scientists, to Blavatsky there was no separation between a magical action and the scientific parameters that have allowed for it to occur. It is merely that much of the modern science in her time wanted nothing to do with magic, or any aspect of psychic or non-physical interaction between matter and consciousness. Whereas now, much according to the predictions of Blavatsky, this materialistic worldview is ever more wobbling on shaky foundations, supported by the puffed-up egos paid and programmed to support our slavish, managed reality, who continuously deny non-physical phenomena such as telepathy even though our technological age is filled with evidence of non-physical signals sent across continental distances and interacting through physical mediums. Blavatsky compares the idea of matter blindly assembling itself into intelligence and biological variety to a lone organ in a cathedral, which, purely as an effect of some chaotic event, randomly reassembles itself into an entire orchestra and plays Mozart's Requiem or some masterpiece of Beethoven. Blavatsky turns gradualistic evolution on its head, arguing that instead of the modern human being an advanced form of a previously less intelligent and far more primitive hominid, we were all already at one point advanced spirits who decided to devolve into our worldly existence. In Blavatsky's case, a soul had to become a god before descending into generation. Quote, universal tradition is indeed the far safer guide in life, and universal tradition shows primitive man living for ages together with his creators and first instructors, the Elohim, in the world's Garden of Eden, or delight. These are the progenitors of what would become the current fifth root race of humans. Here we touch upon a frequent implication in the Secret Doctrine, that human beings are the product of accelerated evolution, this acceleration being administered by more advanced heavenly beings who exhibit physicality to some degree and appear to match the eroded descriptions of larger human-like deities functioning as the rulers, gods, and instructors of ancient civilization. Though no one really wants to be caught admitting it, Blavatsky made a series of startling predictions and key observations that she had no business making in the 1880s unless she was onto something profound. It was part of her argument against the self-assured materialists of her time to indicate that atoms were divisible into dynamic energies and sub-atoms. I, for one, have struggled to find any mention of sub-atom or subatomic anything prior to Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. By all means, show me an earlier instance. And Blavatsky happily quotes the Russian empiricist Butlerov of her time, who was totally, completely, and unequivocally certain that atoms were indivisible, much as other modern materialists are assured of their own uncreative rules, thrust like wisps of fragile smoke against the all-consuming stars of the great mystery. Blavatsky writes, quote, the atom is elastic, ergo the atom is divisible, and must consist of particles or sub-atoms. And these sub-atoms? They are either non-elastic, and in such case they represent no dynamic importance, or they are elastic also, and in that case they, too, are subject to divisibility, and thus ad infinitum. But infinite divisibility of atoms resolves matter into simple centers of force, i.e., precludes the possibility of conceiving matter as an objective substance. This vicious circle is fatal to materialism. It finds itself caught in its own nets, and no issue is possible for it out of the dilemma. Well, fatal it should have been, but as it stands, the cognitive dissonant disease of Western materialism will only die out with the death of its own exponents, who, in the act of dying, will not get to return to their offices and correct all of their mistaken assumptions about the universe. For as we have seen, even when quantum physicists prove that material reality is an illusion, or that matter mostly consists of unverifiable energy between itsy-bitsy wave particles, the paradigm of materialism still asserts itself like some jealous deity to be the only verifiable worldview in the playbook. This is no surprising pattern. We can even paddle out the idea of reality as some computer simulation, and suddenly we spark interest in modern tech-savvy minds, who otherwise strain to realize that the ancient mystics were saying much the same, albeit with the language and the analogies concordant with their time. For, quote, accept the explanations and teachings of occultism, and the blind inertia of physical science being replaced by the intelligent active powers behind the veil of matter, motion and inertia become subservient to those powers, it is on the doctrine of the elusive nature of matter and the infinite divisibility of the atom that the whole science of occultism is built. It opens limitless horizons to substance, informed by the divine breath of its soul in every possible state of tenuity, states still undreamt of by the most spiritually disposed chemists and physicists. Blavatsky understood that all it would take is one true instance of telepathy or telekinesis, and you shatter the entire notion that consciousness is fundamentally and unchangeably a result of brain activity, and somehow accidental. How tragic that souls should fall into generation and obsessively seek to disprove themselves. And yet in that fervent pursuit of ridding the world of God, they have shown empirically that the universe does evolve, that biological life does adapt in order to exist in a manner that further benefits a species, adapts for a purpose, and not blindly or random at all. A testimony rather to the intelligence embedded within nature's every child, and not a testimony to the blind smashing together of atoms that somehow or another result in beauty, symmetry, harmony, growth, love, and every other irrefutable sign of the divine order impressing itself onto the universe. And much to the chagrin and constipation of the scientists dead set on rendering Blavatsky into a footnote of all things laughable and worthless, Blavatsky repositions the esoteric philosopher as one who knows, in truth, more about the state of the universe than any dogmatic materialist. Quote, "Science has no right to deny the occultists their claim to a more profound knowledge of the so-called forces, which they say are only the effects of causes generated by powers, substantial yet supersensuous, and beyond any kind of matter with which they have hitherto become acquainted. The most science can do is to assume the attitude of agnosticism and to maintain it. But to do this requires a boundless love of truth and the surrender of that prestige, however false, of infallibility, which the men of science have acquired among the ignorant and flippant through cultured masses of the profane. To blend the two sciences, the archaic and the modern, requires first of all the abandonment of the actual materialistic lines. It necessitates a kind of religious mysticism, and even the study of old magic, which our academicians will never take up. The necessity is easily explained. Just as in old alchemical works, the real meaning of the substances and elements meant are concealed under the most ridiculous metaphors, so are the physical, psychic, and spiritual natures of the elements concealed in the Vedas, and especially in the Puranas, under allegories comprehensible only to the initiates. A major focus in the Secret Doctrine is also that of the more ancient age of human civilization, which is a notion conforming more to Eastern religious mythology than any of its Western counterparts. This presents another subject few scholars want to touch, nay, even glance at from the safe distance of a space shuttle. This is the idea that modern civilization is but the latest iteration of a series of more ancient and advanced episodes, which have been disfigured but nonetheless transmitted through the myths of Lemuria and Atlantis, massive old continents in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans that were destroyed, not by one but by a series of cataclysmic episodes. What may read like fanciful myths of previous ages, such as the Golden Age of Hesiod, the Zep-Tepi of pre-dynastic Egypt, the fourth race in the Mayan Popol Vuh, the antediluvian fables of Enoch and Noah, are in this way actual residues of prehistory, battered down to a lost chapter in the human story. The one sure way to invite the discrediting criticism of academics and institutional authorities is to engage with these subjects as if they contain any grain of truth. Even figures who engage with the historical layers of mythology are at pains to safeguard the reputation and reduce Atlantis to an empire no more colorful than Plato's descriptions in the Timaeus and Critias. Blavatsky did not use the term Atlanteans to convey any single race, but regarded the Atlantean nation as one containing all 5 racial types, including giants and dwarfs, evidence of which has been dutifully sidelined or ignored by the neo-Darwinists and the playing it safe types. For those of us familiar, for instance, with the Atlantean readings of Edgar Cayce, the so-called sleeping prophet who gave many Atlantean-oriented readings around the 1930s, the following passage from the Secret Doctrine should come as no surprise. The civilization of the Atlanteans was greater even than that of the Egyptians. It is their degenerate descendants, the nation of Plato's Atlantis, which built the first pyramids in the country, and that certainly before the advent of the Eastern Ethiopians, as Herodotus calls the Egyptians. This may be well inferred from the statement made by Ammianus Marcellinus, who says of the pyramids that there are also subterranean passages and winding retreats, which, it is said, men skillful in the ancient mysteries, by means of which they divined the coming of a flood, constructed in different places, lest the memory of all their sacred ceremonies should be lost. These men who divined the coming of floods were not Egyptians, who never had any except the periodical rising of the Nile. Who were they? The last remnants of the Atlanteans, we maintain. Blavatsky in one place fixes the final destruction of the Atlantean remnants to some 12,000 years ago, conforming to the dates given by Plato and those years proven to mark the end of the Younger Dryas and end to the last Ice Age. In other places, she appears to contradict this, as she contradicts herself in a variety of ways when it comes to her rounds and races. It is difficult to navigate her long timelines and her occasional certainty about the destinies and peculiar themes of every race and round. Also, if it is not only her producing this text, but those instructions of her masters, we are confronted with another challenge in parsing out who is saying what. The Secret Doctrine is, be warned, turgid, dense, and not at all beautiful on the whole. Nonetheless, she does not impale herself on the need to be perfectly correct in all of her dates and scientific speculations. She asserts many unprovable facts and frequently relies on other authors to give them, authors which in no way align with her overall message. While the Secret Doctrine maintains many insightful passages, it no less occludes some of its major points behind a bewildering degree of comparisons and relies on the reader to have some sense of each one of them. Thus, the reader may be struck with intrigue and insight on one page and slammed with a brick wall of diverting new phrases and references on the next. But true to her purpose, she's attempting a gargantuan lift, and the weight of it certainly shows in more ways than one. It is entirely possible that in her effort to squeeze so much through the door, many of her simpler points can fail to slip through, as they are attached to so much else laborious and unverifiable. Thus, we must conclude by adhering to this trusty guideline. When you find yourself lost on the frontier, return to universals, reset back to first principles. What then are the major principles Blavatsky is trying to heave across the line, while being challenged by her ill health and her approaching death? If we had to reduce the Secret Doctrine to its core principles, we would end up with something like the following. 1. One absolute reality underlies everything. Regardless of how common it is to find in the teachings of mystics that need to pretend one's own school of thought is actually in possession of the greatest concept of the singular and universal God, that singularity is, by its own nature, inexpressible and incomprehensible, though its existence alone can be communicated in unlimited ways. Oneness is, however much it may be subject to abstraction, actually the most simple divine principle. Oneness supersedes all distinction and separation, and, like the primeval blackness, contains all that is, in an ocean of infinite potential. God, most properly elevated to this monad, is the overarching beingness in everything, You cannot escape or define it. You cannot move or contradict it. Blavatsky's letters demonstrate her own personal understanding of this unity. Quote, "My own ambition is finally to become the all, to be at last drawn to and absorbed in nirvana as a drop of vapor is drawn to the ocean, and there, losing my personal individuality, to replace it by the impersonal individuality of the universal essence, which the Christians and other deists call God, and that I, in my school, call the universal cause which has neither intelligence nor desire nor will, because it is absolute intelligence, desire, and will." 2. The universe operates in cycles. Cosmic and worldly phases are as natural as the cycles of the earth, sun, and moon, as integral as birth and death, beginning and end. There are cycles within cycles, and as the lesser cycles complete, they are subsumed continuously in the greater cycles of stars and galaxies, which operate on much higher planes of consciousness. Negative karmic cycles may also be played out or spun up in the lifetimes of beings. Themes and patterns of behavior and challenges may be explored until their courses are complete, and they further propel souls into additional cycles of exploration. 3. Everything in the universe evolves spiritually. Considering the inseparability of the spirit to all things, the universe is thus confined within the parameters of its divine order, which is inherently in service to greater spiritual existences which are incomprehensible to the incarnate physical personality. And yet, the more we examine the universe scientifically and intuitively, we find that all of nature's observables maintain underlying symmetries, harmonies, and adaptive characteristics which present themselves like teases to greater invisible forms and principles that govern them. Evolution in itself, though it is spoken of as a god by many, is inseparable from the divine order it is expressing. All biological potentials must in this way contain an inherent reason principle which causes life forms to adjust and adapt for their own benefit. To touch back on our previous analogy of the orchestra, we know that the most beautiful musical productions already exist in potential prior to the production of any musical instrument. Why would there not be an infinite scale of other potentials already existing, despite us not having made the instruments to manifest them yet? 4. Matter and spirit are interconnected. Matter in the Secret Doctrine is, no less than other mystical systems, simply a densification of consciousness, offering an entire physical plane of experience for entities to explore. The famous and many mythological wars in heaven are expressions of, quote, the war between spirit and matter. This war will last till the inner and divine man adjusts his outer terrestrial self to his own spiritual nature. Till then, the dark and fierce passions of the former will be at eternal feud with his master, the divine man. But the animal will be tamed one day, because its nature will be changed, and harmony will reign once more between the two, as before the fall, when even mortal man was created by the elements and was not born. 5. Karma and reincarnation govern life. This principle reinforces free will and cause and effect, and reconciles the obvious shortcomings of human life and its apparent, undeserved cycles of suffering into a coherent system of justice, giving the individual the gavel of free will to pronounce their own sentencing. Quote, it is only this doctrine, we say, that can explain to us the mysterious problem of good and evil, and reconcile man to the terrible and apparent injustice of life. Nothing but such certainty can quiet our revolted sense of justice. For when one unacquainted with the noble doctrine looks around him and observes the inequalities of birth and fortune, of intellect and capacities, when one sees honor-paid fools and profligates, on whom fortune has heaped her favors by mere privilege of birth, and their nearest neighbor, with all his intellectual and noble virtues, far more deserving in every way, perishing of want and for lack of sympathy, when one sees all this and has to turn away, helpless to relieve the undeserved suffering, one's ears ringing and heart aching with the cries of pain around him, that blessed knowledge of karma alone prevents him from cursing life and men, as well as their supposed creator. 6. Ancient wisdom holds universal truths. Blavatsky is expressly concerned with an esoteric universalism, a perennial mysticism which beholds common truths at the core of every variety of religious expression. These common truths, as evident as the common star of every nation, around which our common planet revolves, are not newly born from the equations of physicists, or freshly wrought by the next mystic's out-of-body experience, but are like the placid stones of bedrock, always there to be slammed into by any who dig their shovels deeply enough. 7. Humanity is guided by spiritual hierarchies. In the Secret Doctrine, much mention is made of a host of greater spiritual entities involved in the evolution of the cosmos and all physical bodies. Non-physical entities from elsewhere were at the root of man's current densified physical experience. Much as Cronus neutered his father Uranus, the heavens, Cronus as Father Time created an age whereby those beings coming from space and greater dimensions were prevented by the beginning of a new cycle from further manipulation with the beings of earth, and all the other fallen angels or gods walking among men and giants and archaic pygmies were left to sort out their common habitation until the next cycle of Father Zeus brought forth a new era of humanity, spat out of the sea by so many floods, to piece together some vague and foggy notion of the collective past, while scraping together their future civilizations with the remnants of lost and more advanced predecessors. 8. The universe is filled with hidden forces. This concludes our first look at the Secret Doctrine of Madame Blavatsky. If you would like to see more essays on her works or her life, please leave it in the comments. Thank you for liking and subscribing, and be well.